So I saw a tweet over the weekend mentioning the consistency of the Iowa Hawkeyes. I kept trying to wrap my head around Kirk Ferentz and how he's about to enter his 28th season at Iowa, a program that still performs basically the same way it did a decade ago. Most coaches hit a burnout point, or the sport shifts. Maybe the roster doesn't survive a down year. But somehow, Iowa avoids all of that. And that's where this started. And the first markers are the basic numbers. Ferentz is 206 and 125 at Iowa. If you include his main years, he's 216 and 145. He's coached 330 plus games at Iowa alone, which makes him the longest tenured active coach in the FBS by a wide margin. He also hasn't had a losing season since 2012, which is a streak most people don't associate with Iowa because the style isn't flashy, but the record is there. And since 2001, after his rebuild kicked in, Iowa has only had 2 losing seasons in total, 2006 and 2012. The next thing that jumped out was the consistency since 2015. In every full season since then, Iowa hit 8 or more wins. That's 10 years straight. Statistically, the only other programs with that run are Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State. Programs with national title budgets, national recruiting reach, and top 5 roster talent. Iowa recruits in the 30s or 40s most years, but their 2026 class sits at 24th in the nation. The gap between expected talent and actual production is one of the widest in the country. And to understand that, you have to go back to the start. Ferentz opened his Iowa career at 1-10 and followed that up with a 3-9 record the next year. 4 wins in 2 seasons. And in 2025, no Power 5 school would tolerate that. But Iowa did. They kept him for a 3rd year, even though the roster was thin and the record didn't show any progress. Year 3 was 7-5. Year 4 was 11-2 and a Big Ten title. That decision, sticking with a coach who started 4-19, basically shaped everything that came afterwards. They gave him a long runway, and they found out what his system actually looked like when it had time to take root. What schools would even give a coach that time in 2025? Once you understand the patience, the scheme makes more sense. The offense is built around 2 tight ends because it stabilizes the run game and simplifies blocking assignments. Iowa's run game isn't about explosive plays, it's about avoiding negative ones. And that alone keeps them competitive, because they don't put their quarterbacks into long yardage situations where the offense isn't equipped to win. Defensively, the numbers are clear. Since 2015, Iowa has finished top 20 in scoring defense in 8 different seasons. In 2022 and 2023, they were top 5. They allowed 14.8 points per game in 2023 and only gave up more than 20 points 4 times. They went 12 straight games that year without allowing 400 yards. And that's not a stat you get from chaos or even blitz-heavy scheming. That comes from structure. And the structure is straightforward. A 4-2-5 with quarters coverage behind it. 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, and a 5th defensive back who plays like a hybrid. The 2 safety shell forces teams to take the short routes. It's a low variance defense. It's hard to create big plays against it unless you know how to beat someone one-on-one. And Iowa recruits players who handle those assignments well. Phil Parker has been teaching this system for decades, and Norm Parker ran the earlier version of it. And Phil kept almost everything intact when he took over in 2012. And that's the continuity that shows up on tape. The results line up with the developmental model. If you look at every high-end Iowa defensive back in the NFL, Micah Hyde, Desmond King, Amani Hooker, Riley Moss, Geno Stone, and Cooper DeJean, they all came from similar recruiting backgrounds. DeJean was a multi-sport kid from a small town. King was a mid-tier 3-star. Hyde was barely recruited. Iowa puts them in the same coverage system for 4 or 5 years and gives them the same reads. The consistency adds up. The offense doesn't change much either, which is why their offensive line production is so steady. Marshall Yanda, Brian Bulaga, the technique they learned came from the same zone-based run structure that never shifted dramatically. And you may think that Iowa is only good at producing the secondary, but let's talk about the tight end list, which is even more straightforward. George Kittle was a 2-star. Dallas Clark was a walk-on. TJ Hawkinson was a mid-level 3-star. Noah Fant and Sam Laporta weren't national names either. All of them came out of a role that demanded they block and run routes in a pro-style system, not a spread-only passing role. And that's why they translate cleanly to the NFL. Here's another piece that makes the longevity easier to understand. The staff doesn't flip. Phil Parker has been there since 1999. Reese Morgan coached there for decades. The strength program was stable for most of Ferentz's run. And there's no annual overhaul of terminology or roles. Most Power 5 programs experience heavy turnover. But Iowa, they rarely do. Iowa's history under Ferentz has defined itself by peaks that match the system's maturity cycles. 2002 Big Ten champions with an 11-2 record. 2004, another Big Ten title. 2009, 11-2 with an Orange Bowl win. 2015, they were 12-0 regular season. and had a 16-3 loss in the Big Ten Championship. That came down to a 9-minute Michigan State game-winning drive. Then the recent run, West Division titles in 2021 and 2023, and the structure doesn't produce wild swings. But when the roster lines up, when you have veteran linemen, experienced linebackers, and upper-class tight ends, that's when your ceiling rises. And a small detail that caught my attention was the fact that Iowa hasn't fired a head coach since the 1960s. That's Paul Deitzel's era. We have Kirk Ferentz, who's going on his 28th year, and that guy's going to end up retiring at Iowa. When you overlay that with Ferentz's track record, the picture gets cleaner. There's institutional stability. Iowa built an environment where long-term development is possible, and Ferentz is the one coach who's been able to operate inside it uninterrupted. The broader context is the final layer. The Big Ten has changed multiple times. Nebraska joined in 2011, Maryland and Rutgers in 2014, and now we have 4 West Coast programs in 2024. The entire sport shifted to spread offenses and high tempo. Then you have portal-based roster construction, and now the NIL. Iowa stayed almost the same through all of it, yet the results stayed steady. That doesn't make the system right or wrong, it just makes it unusual, and something that is worth examining. Looking at all this together, the reason Ferentz has lasted became pretty clear. Iowa gave him patience before his system produced wins, and the schemes are intentionally simple and reward experience. The staff stayed intact, and the recruiting model focuses on traits and long developmental cycles. The program avoids the volatility that knocks other teams off course. The numbers reflect that structure: winning seasons almost every year, a decade of 8+ win seasons, and NFL talent that routinely outperforms its recruiting rankings. The Hawkeyes finished 2025 with an 8-4 record, and all of their losses were within the range of 2 to 5 points. One of the most underrated seasons in recent memory. Hence my interest. And the evidence points to a program that made a choice about how it wanted to operate, and it didn't move away from it. Nothing more layered or philosophical than that. And the stability explains the winning, and the winning explains the stability. Thank you all so much for watching.